Hello and welcome back to CAMS 1103. In the song Paperback Writer, what is the paperback writer's book based on? Enjoy the lecture.
So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with archaeology. Very famously, towards the end of the 19th century, a German amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann dug into a mound in northwest Asia Minor, that is, northwest Turkey as we think of it, and found a place that people had built on over and over and over again. It was a place that's known in Turkey as Hisarlik. Now, I could tell you a long and fascinating story about the various kinds of archaeological and documentary evidence that exist and really, I think, don't exist for the connection of this mound into which Schliemann dug with the Troy that we know from the Iliad and from the rest of the epic cycle, including the Odyssey. And I encourage you to take a look at the Wikipedia article on Troy because it's pretty good, both in laying out the reasons to think that this mound equals Troy and in laying out the problems with the evidence. Although I wish the article stated a bit more clearly how strong the opposition is, as well as how strong the support is for the idea. And here's the key thing, that this city that is referred to in some Hittite texts as Wilusa is the same as the city that we know as Ilion, and then later in Latin Ilium. The whole problem is compounded by the fact that the top layer of this layer cake into which Schliemann dug was a city called Ilium that existed in Hellenistic times and was thought of by the Romans as well as having been the ancient site of Troy. Let me just put it this way. To my mind, there is not a single shred of strong evidence that supports the idea that Hisarlik is Troy. And also, to my mind, there is all sorts of circumstantial evidence that indicates that, at the very least, the bards who were composing the Iliad were not thinking about this place that we know as Hisarlik when they were telling their stories of Troy. But please feel absolutely free to make up your own mind about this evidence, especially because going along with me on this matter ends up not being an especially important part of understanding what Troy means as a myth. Because whether by some amazing chance an actual historical record of a conflict that actually happened at Hisarlik survived in the oral recomposition of epic poetry that we know more or less destroys facts in a very short time of oral tradition, or whether it's a complete fabrication, its cultural truth value, its rooty thing, its meaning for both the Greeks who came afterwards and for us is completely unaffected. The fact that the Greeks believed in it to the extent that they believed in any of their myths means that it held strong cultural truth values for them, and that when we investigate the narrative of the story, we can also investigate those cultural truth values. And that, in turn, brings us to Troy as the Iliad. The first thing to look at is how Troy can, for the Greeks, be the story of the entire Trojan War. How is it that that title, Iliad, can actually refer to an epic that is actually only about those 20 days during which Achilles decided he was going to sit out of the battle, at the end of which he returns because his friend Patroclus gets killed and he kills Hector, and then Hector's body gets ransomed. How is it that that more or less little story about something that happened in the last year of the war can be called the Iliad, the story of Troy? The answer is actually very cool. What I want to demonstrate is that an epic work of art, by its very nature, has the power to recapitulate, to more or less repeat within its bounds the entire larger epic story of which it's a part. In terms of its actual plot, in terms of its actual content, from a narrative point of view, no, it doesn't tell the whole story. But in terms of its thematics, it tells us everything we need to know about Troy and about what Troy means. And I want to explore that with the help of John Ford's amazing and genre-defining Western, The Searchers, made in 1956. Here's the opening sequence. That sequence begins with one of John Ford's favorite shots. That is a shot of a western landscape through the frame, usually of a door, as here, when the woman who turns out to be the John Wayne character's sister opens the door to look out on the western landscape, a western landscape that we know very well from having seen so many westerns, even if we grew up later than the great time of the westerns, because of course the western is a genre that continues. We watch old westerns and the newer westerns that we watch these days that are kind of different in their themes from the older westerns, nevertheless use the landscapes of the older westerns, the western landscapes that are made famous above all by John Ford. And this is John Ford's favorite landscape to use. It's a landscape in Monument Valley, Utah. And then across this landscape you see the John Wayne character riding, and he evokes in his solitude on that landscape all of the other great solitary characters, the great solitary heroes of westerns. And the use of the framing itself is the most important device of all, because in that framing, Ford expresses the entire history of the West. That is, the West as that same civilizing process that we saw when we talked about Manifest Destiny in the Godfather clip in the Succession lecture. In the course of about 30 seconds, therefore, John Ford gets the entirety of the Western and of the West into this one movie. And to confirm that, I want to show you a little bit of the introduction of John Wayne as the character Ethan in his inimitable persona of the Western hero. There are three things I want to point out about the way Ethan Edwards, the John Wayne character, is introduced to us. The first of these is about his outfit. We later learn that he has fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and he is wearing a Confederate greatcoat. But if you notice, he is wearing Union pants. The other thing about his outfit is that he's wearing a black hat. And these things together indicate that he is a highly ambiguous figure. He has been presented to us as somebody who has to be the hero of the movie in the shot where he moved across the landscape. But now we see that he's going to be a kind of ambiguous hero. The question of whether he's really a hero is going to be central to the movie. The second thing I want to point out is his amazing inscrutability. That is, when you look at him, you can't tell what he's thinking, and this is something that John Wayne and other Western heroes are famous for. He's a cipher, as I always like to say, and that makes him very good for projecting rooty things, cultural truth values onto, and for kind of ambiguous identification. And then the final thing is the way that the other characters react to him, which is precisely as an ambiguous figure, a figure that they can't figure out. They don't know whether he's going to be a hero for them or a villain for them. So the comparison that I want to make with the Searchers in the Iliad is to say that just as John Ford in the Searchers is first able to create a Western that embodies all of the Western with a capital W, in the same way the Iliad is able with its own opening to capture the entirety of the Trojan War. And then, just as against that backdrop of one microcosm representing the entirety of a myth, John Ford brings this ambiguous John Wayne character, so the Homeric bards in the Iliad bring the story of Achilles' wrath, a questioning of what it means to be a hero, up against the backdrop of the entirety of the Trojan War that they create at the very beginning. Like the Searchers, then, the Iliad is a way of both telling the entire story of the Trojan War and focusing in very closely in a way that helps its audience think about what it means to them to have this story be so important.